Okay. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second day of the book festival sponsored by the Lifeline Learning Committee of Bethel Synagogue and the Jewish for Good, which is our Jewish Community Center for those that don't know that. It's my pleasure to introduce, excuse me, Ruth Behar, who was born in Havana and in 1956 to a family of combination of Sephardic, Turkish, Ashkenazi, Polish, and Russian ancestry. She immigrated to the United States and attended schools in New York, graduated from Wesleyan College undergrad in 1977, and studied cultural anthropology at Princeton, earning her doctorate in 1983. She travels regularly to Cuba and Mexico to study aspects of culture, as well as to investigate, her Jewish roots in Cuba. She has won many awards, including the MacArthur Genius Grant, the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship, and the Belpre Medal, which is presented to a Latino author and is a very prestigious medal in the literary world. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ruth Behar.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. How is everybody doing today? Hope you're all doing well. Thank you so much for having me. It's very, very nice to be here with you, and we're going to have a very nice and intimate conversation. So I'm going to tell you about my new book, Letters from Cuba, which is also in Spanish, Cartas de Cuba, so you can read it in either language or both. And then I'll also tell you about the book that I wrote before Letters from Cuba, which is Lucky Broken Girl. And then I'm going to give you a bit of a teaser about my new book, which is a picture book. And we'll tell you a little bit about that. So nice to be here. Buenas tardes, everybody. And I'm going to share my screen so that I can show you some images. And see, can everybody see that? I hope just the cover of the book. So I'm going to start by just telling you for a moment a little bit about the cover. The covers are always so important in a book, and this one was made by an artist named John Parra, a Latino artist based in New York. And if you look at it carefully, he did something really wonderful, which is that he showed the three places that the book covers. If you look up at the left-hand corner, that represents Poland, which is the country that our protagonist Esther is leaving. Then in the center part of the image, we've got the ocean, right? And then the ship. And she's making this long journey across the sea, going from Poland to Cuba. And then this down here is the city of Havana. We see the Cuban flag. We see the Capitolio, which is the Capitol building of Havana, modeled on the US Capitol. And then down in the foreground, we see some trees, palm trees and other trees, and some agricultural land down there as well. And that's meant to represent the town of Agramonte, because Esther goes to live not in Havana, but in a small town in the countryside called Agramonte. So this cover very nicely brings together those three places. And this is a book about the search for home, and the three places converge very nicely in the cover image. So my book, Letters from Cuba, is inspired by the story of my grandmother, Esther. It's not exactly her story, but it was inspired by her strength, what she was willing to do to help save her family. That was really the inspiration for this book. And it's very much a kind of Purim story, because she's very much an Esther figure in the biblical sense, a contemporary Esther figure. And that was how I thought about it. My grandmother was born on Purim, and she never knew her exact birthday, but she knew that she was born on Purim. And so we would celebrate her birthday on March 15th, but she was very much a true Esther. So here's my grandmother with my grandfather in Cuba. That was my grandmother Esther and my grandfather Maximo, who, as Lois said, my grandfather was Russian from Belarusia, and my grandmother was Polish. They met in Cuba, married in Cuba, and started a family there. And here I am with them. I was very, very close to both of my maternal grandparents. I was also close to my paternal grandparents, but much more to this set of grandparents because I just lived closer to them when I was growing up. And then my grandmother lived to be 92, and I spent a lot of time with her. So I heard a lot of her stories, and that was why she ended up inspiring this book. So as they grew older, we resettled in New York. And as they grew older, my grandparents retired to Miami Beach, and this was their little condo in Miami Beach. My grandmother frequently making cookies called quejeles. She would be making cookies, and my grandfather would be washing the dishes. And then eventually he passed away, and she lived to be 92. So I spent a lot of time with her and listening to her stories. So you might be wondering, why did Jewish people go to Cuba, right? Of all the places they could immigrate to, why Cuba? Well, they really did want to come to the United States, but the US passed an Immigration and Nationality Act in 1924 that limited the numbers of people that could come, particularly from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, to the United States. Those were the unwanted immigrants at the time. And here you can see the quota numbers, just how few people could enter the US from Poland and from Turkey. And those were two major countries from which Jewish people were trying to immigrate in the period between World War I and World War II. It just so happens that's where my mother's and father's family were from. And so they couldn't get into the US, but they heard that Cuba was very, very close to the United States. And if they could just get to Cuba, they could practically swim over to the US. That was what they heard in an era when there wasn't, that much information. And so many Jewish immigrants went to Cuba, thousands and thousands of them. In this period, they took that route from Europe to Cuba. And as you can see on the map, Cuba is indeed very, very close to the United States. It's the only person who I think has swum from one place to another is the great swimmer Diana Nyad, if you've heard of her, who's actually has swum from the US to Cuba, but that is a very rare thing to do. But that was what they knew, that it was close by. And many Jewish immigrants did indeed use Cuba as a kind of trampoline to eventually get to the US. They would stay in Cuba for a few years and then essentially go to the US as Cuban immigrants rather than as European immigrants. But the majority actually came to really love Cuba, as did my family. And once they were in Cuba, they didn't really want to go anywhere else. They thought of Cuba as their America, and they stayed there until, as we'll see in a moment, until the Cuban Revolution. So let's get back to my grandmother's story. So my grandmother was from this town called Goworowo near Warsaw. Several years ago, I had the opportunity to go and see the town that she was from. I always heard about Goworowo. She had the memorial book for the town, and this is where she was from. And she left the town behind to go to Cuba and meet up with her father. Here's my grandmother as a young woman. And so what happened? Between World War I and World War II, as you know, there was growing poverty, desperation, growing anti-Semitism, and many Jews were already trying to leave Poland and other parts of Europe at this time. And so my family was really struggling, and my great-grandfather went off to Cuba. He heard about Cuba, as I said. And the plan was for him to make money and bring the rest of the family to Cuba. But he was a very religious man, and he wasn't a very good businessman, and he was peddling and wasn't making all that much money. But after 3 years, he made enough money to bring one of his children to Cuba with the hope that that child would help him bring the rest of the family. My grandmother was one of 7 children, and then there was her mother and her grandmother. In the book, I changed it to 5 rather than 7 children, but But anyway, so my great-grandfather in real life was in Cuba and, struggled to make enough for steamship passage for one of his children. And he wanted his son Moshe to come. And Moshe was the second born, and a boy, of course. But my grandmother was the firstborn, and she was a girl. And so she heard that her father wanted to bring Moshe first, and she was very upset because she was the eldest. And she wrote to her father and she pleaded with him and said, I'm the eldest and I should be the first to go to Cuba. And even though I'm a girl, I'm a young woman, I promise I'm going to help you bring everybody to Cuba. And she convinced her father. And so she was the first of the children to go to Cuba, to meet up with him, which was not easy, to find him when she got to Havana, and help him bring the rest of the family to Cuba. So that was the story that I always heard from my grandmother, that she had helped to bring her siblings and her mother to Cuba. And I thought that was such a fascinating story and such an interesting story from a feminist perspective too, that she had said she should be first as the firstborn, and convinced her father. And so she did help to reunite the family in Cuba. She's here with her siblings. So my grandmother is the woman in the white dress in the front, and next to her is my great-grandmother. And this is my great-grandfather with the Panama hat, and my grandfather on the other side. So the family was reunited. And interestingly, they went to live in this small town that I've mentioned called Agramonte. And I was just fascinated by the idea that this Jewish family went to live in the countryside. They were the only Jewish family living there. And as an anthropologist as well, I was just so fascinated by that and thought, wow, I wonder what that was like, to land in the countryside in Cuba, not in Havana, where there was already a Jewish community developing, and there were Jewish restaurants and schools and institutions and synagogues forming and so on. Here they were out in the boondocks in Cuba. And I was just so intrigued by that and decided that I would have to set my book in Agramonte, because that would be very interesting. We have a lot of books set in Havana, but not many books set in Agramonte. So the book is set there. And one of the very moving things that I thought about as I wrote this book was that not everybody made it to Cuba. There was part of the family that stayed behind in Poland. This was my grandmother's grandmother, and she chose not to go to Cuba. She thought Poland was a much more civilized place than Cuba. Of course, they didn't have a lot of information. Cuba was actually doing quite well at that time in the 20s and 30s, and was actually very developed, but they didn't know. They just knew that Cuba was a tropical island. They thought maybe it was like a jungle. She didn't want to go, and she stayed, and like so many others, she perished in the war and the Holocaust, and that always led me to think about how Cuba became a refuge for my Jewish family. And this picture hung on my grandparents' wall, and so I was always aware of those that made it and those that didn't make it, to freedom and to safety and to life. So I went to Agramonte. I went to Cuba several times, actually, to do research on the Jewish community of Cuba. And then I went specifically to do research in the town of Agramonte to find out about this town. What was it like? What was the history of this town? These are some historical photos of Agramonte from the 20s and 30s. And there were several people in the town who were really interested in the history of their town. They're local historians. And so they shared photographs, they shared information, they shared stories and legends. And it was really, really fascinating research for me. So here's what Agramonte looks like today. And as you know, Cubans continue to maintain these old American cars from the 1950s. This car might have a Toyota engine in it, but it's still got the outer husk of an old Chevy or Buick. And so this is very, very common in Cuba. And this is what Agramonte looks like today. And I met a lot of fascinating people. I stayed there for a little while, and who told me again about the history of their town. And I just tried to imagine my Jewish family living in this corner of Cuba. And so among the interesting things about this part of Cuba is that there was a strong sugar growing community there, that the Spaniards at the time in the colonial period brought enslaved Africans to Cuba from West Africa. They were mainly Yoruba speaking people, and they were forced to work in the sugarcane, cutting sugarcane and processing it and making sugar, which is very, very difficult and very brutal work. And so that's a part of the history of this region of Cuba. There was such a strong presence of people from West Africa in this part of Cuba that it's called Little Africa. There are, of course, Afro-Cubans all over the island, but this region in particular had a very, very strong number of them, and they brought a lot of their traditions, the religious and spiritual traditions, with them to Cuba. Okay, so among the things that I learned about was this sacred tree, this ceiba tree, or it's known as baobab in English, and I was really fascinated by this. As you can see, the tree has these chains around its trunk, and that represents slavery. And this woman told me about how people leave offerings to the spirits of enslaved Africans at the base of this tree. And I was just so taken by that. And I thought, well, this is going to have to be in the story. And my protagonist, Esther, is going to learn about this and learn about this whole other culture, this whole other religion that she knew nothing about, coming from Poland. So that gets integrated into the story. In Cuba, there's a lot of syncretism between different religious deities. So the Virgin of Regla, who's a very important virgin figure in Cuba, her shrine is right at the entrance to the port of Havana. This Spanish the Spanish Virgin becomes syncretized or meshed with a different goddess, a different sea goddess named Yemaya, who's an ocean goddess from the Yoruba tradition. And so I was fascinated by this, the way there's this set of correspondences between the Catholic saints and the African orishas or deities. And you see a lot of that in various parts of Cuba, and very, very strongly in this part of Cuba that I was researching in Agramonte. And they have a strong belief in one particular deity there, Saint Lazarus in the Catholic pantheon, or Babalu Aye in the Yoruba pantheon. If you remember seeing I Love Lucy, the great sitcom with Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz, you'll remember that Desi was always singing the song Babalu, Babalu Aye. I'm sure some of you remember. And so it was a reference to this particular deity, an African deity, a West African deity, Babalu Aye, who gets meshed with Saint Lazarus, and his colors are purple. And this deity in particular is very venerated in Agramonte, in this part of Cuba. And so they'll have these 3-day saint parties, and people go into trance, and there's drumming. It's very, very culturally rich thing to witness. And so I was able to see that, and I also integrated that into the story and was just trying to imagine what it would be like to be a Jewish person and be witnessing these very, very different religions and be brought into them, in fact, as Esther is in the story. So there we go. Sorry, my computer's there. I think that's okay. And so I mentioned drumming. So the drumming is very important. I got to witness this as well. What are known as bata drums. These are drums that, rather than being drummed from the top like conga drums, they're drummed on their sides. And there's always 3 of them, a large, a medium, and a small. And they're used in these religious rituals. And they're very, very, very beautiful to listen to. They're very, very trance-inducing as well because of the way they're drummed, the rhythms of the drums. And this comes directly from the Yoruba tradition from West Africa. So it's very powerful to see how so much of the culture from Africa was held on to, even though people from West Africa were obviously treated very brutally as slaves. So that's a powerful current in the novel, and it leads Esther to think about how Jewish people have preserved traditions over such a long period of time, and how people of African descent have as well in the story. So let me go to the next one. So that was an important part of my thinking behind this book. And then I wanted to also integrate the Chinese-Cuban presence in Cuba, because most people don't know that there is a very large community of Chinese Cubans as well. This is a photograph, a fairly recent photograph from the Chinese neighborhood in Havana. So if you go to Cuba, you can see this, and there are many people of Chinese background who still live in Havana and elsewhere in Cuba. And there were several people with this background who lived in this town of Agramonte. When I did my historical research, I found that there were people that owned small shops, grocery stores in Agramonte, and that inspired some of my characters. Chinese people came to Cuba in the 19th century because sugar was doing so well in Cuba that they didn't have enough labor, they didn't have enough enslaved Africans, and so Chinese indentured laborers came in the 19th century, and they worked in the sugar fields as well. And many of them, or all of them, I should say, were men, and many of them married Afro-Cuban women. So there are these combinations of Chinese, Afro-Cuban mixtures. And the Chinese are remembered in Cuba for having fought for the independence of Cuba. There's this monument that you just saw. This is a monument in Havana here we go. This is the monument. And then the plaque is underneath the monument, remembering how the Chinese fought for the independence of Cuba at the end of the 19th century. So I wanted to also evoke that presence. And so there are Chinese Cuban characters as well in the story. And then, of course, there's the whole Jewish presence in Cuba. It's a lot smaller. There were about 15,000 Jews at the peak, as we see here in 1959. And it's very interesting that Jews largely settled in Havana and Santiago de Cuba, the two major cities of the island, but they also spread out throughout the island to the interior, the major interior cities, and also other cities, other provincial cities throughout the island. They formed Jewish cemeteries, and sometimes you find a Jewish cemetery in the most unexpected place. I went to this little town called Camajuani, and Camajuani happens to have a Sephardic cemetery, which is a very small one, but it's there. And there's another Jewish cemetery in Banes. And then all of the big towns, Guantanamo, Santiago, which Santi Espiritu, these all have Santa Clara. They all have Jewish cemeteries, and there's 2 Jewish cemeteries outside of Havana. So the community, though small, was quite vibrant, and in just a few decades, they created a lot of important Jewish institutions, not just synagogues, but Jewish schools as well, and businesses and restaurants and so on. So that's very interesting. It says something about the tolerance of Cubans towards Jews, and how Jews felt comfortable enough to create all of these institutions and organizations for themselves on the island of Cuba. And most significantly, in the mid-1950s, the Jewish community, in 1953, they begin to envision having a Jewish community center in Havana that we call the Patronato, and it's a very, very large, impressive building, that had a banquet hall, it still has a library, and anyway, a very, very major building that was designed by one of Cuba's major architects at the time. And if you've been to Cuba, I'm sure you've been to the Patronato. This is what it looks like. And we lived very, very nearby, just half a block away. So this building was part of my childhood landscape. So the Jewish community found a refuge, found a home in Cuba. So to summarize, I wanted to bring together all of these different cultures and characters from the Spanish, the African, the Chinese, and Jewish Cuban traditions. We have Esther learning about Cuban culture from friends and neighbors of various kinds, all of them very welcoming to her and her father. There's the doctor, Dr. Pablo, and his wife, Senora Graciela, and they have suffered from a tragedy. Their daughter, who is Esther's age, died. And Dr. Pablo, despite being a doctor, wasn't able to save his own daughter, so they have lived with that tragedy. Manuela becomes Esther's good friend, and she's an Afro-Cuban girl, and her grandmother was an enslaved African. Her father, Mario Jose, works in the sugar fields. Francisco Chang becomes another one of her friends. He's a Chinese-Cuban boy, and he lives and works with his uncle, Juan Chang. And they all support Esther and her papa against the hate-filled person in their lives, Senor Eduardo, who's the plantation owner, who's very exploitative of his employees, and also a horrid anti-Semite. So those are some of the characters. And then there are Jewish characters in Havana, Rivka Rubinstein and Zvi Mandelbaum, who help Esther and her father financially to get themselves into a better place. They're storekeepers. So it was really fascinating to know all this history, to have done all of this research, and then try to imagine how to anchor it in actual characters and actual scenes and situations. And that's where the fictional work happened, in imagining that whole world. And so Esther has to find a way to bring her family to Cuba. She recognizes that her father is not very practical. He prefers to pray most of the time than to be trying to make money. And she thinks about, what one of her skills is. And one of those skills is sewing dresses. Her mother taught her how to sew. And when she gets to Cuba, she realizes that the woolen dress that she's wearing, the woolen stockings and the boots that she's come with in January are just going to be way too warm to wear in Cuba. She's got to find lighter, airier clothes to wear. And after some time working, they make enough money that she can buy some fabric. And she makes a dress for herself and the friends that she makes in Agramonte, and then goes to Havana and talks to Rivka, and Rivka Rubinstein sees the dresses that she's making and is very impressed. And that's how Esther starts selling her dresses. And so I want to show you this. This is an alternative cover for the book. As you probably know, when an artist designs a book cover, they'll make 2 or 3 or 4 versions of potential covers. So this was another cover. And I just like it also because it shows the dress, the importance of the dress, and many of the symbols from the book, the sewing machine, and the letters, the flag, and so on, the spool. So this one evokes that whole notion of the importance of sewing in this story. And so I had the idea that Esther would find a way to get her dresses to the most important store in Cuba at the time, this very elegant store that I always heard about, El Encanto, that most people couldn't shop at. It was way too expensive, but it was still this idea of Havana having a store that had Parisian fashions. And so El Encanto, which literally means the enchantment, figures in the book, and it's in the central part of Havana. And Esther dreams of getting her dresses to El Encanto, because if she can sell them there, they will make a lot of money and be able to bring the family to Cuba. And well, if you haven't read the book, you have to read the book to see how that all happens. So I had a lot of fun also researching El Encanto, again, which was this very important store. And there are still people in Miami who used to work at El Encanto back in the late 50s, and they get together periodically to reminisce. So here's another picture, another historical picture of El Encanto. And it's very interesting. The store burnt down at the beginning of the Cuban Revolution, so it's gone. It's part of a history that's been lost, and I wanted to recreate that in my book. So those are all elements that came together for me as I thought of telling the story and thought of just imagining my grandmother as a young woman coming to Cuba, having to learn Spanish. How did a girl who spoke Yiddish and Polish, how did she learn Spanish? How did she find a way to manage in this new climate, this tropical climate? What did it feel like when she tasted a pineapple and a mango and bananas? So there was a lot that I knew about my grandmother, but a lot that I didn't know, a lot of just, daily life kinds of things that I had fun imagining and fictionalizing them. And so I came up with the idea that the book would be told in the form of letters. And I thought of the letters as almost a magical thing, that if she keeps writing to her sister, she's collecting these letters for her younger sister, Malka, then her sister's going to have to come to Cuba to read them, because she doesn't know at that moment how her sister will ever get to Cuba. It seems so difficult at first how they will ever make enough money to bring the family. And of course, they don't know that the war is going to happen, that there's going to be a Holocaust. I mean, no one knows that. But she knows that there's poverty. She knows the family is struggling. She knows there's growing anti-Semitism and that she's got to bring her sister and her family to Cuba. And so these letters become this kind of magnet. She's writing these letters and really sharing what's in her heart with her younger sister. And of course, immigrants wrote a lot of letters. This was how they communicated. And so I also looked up old letters and thought about how letters were written at this time. And so each letter documents a different moment in her journey, in Esther's journey from Poland to Cuba. It was really fascinating to imagine what it would have been like to have been young and be crossing the ocean by yourself and not knowing if you're going to make it, not knowing if she's going to find her father. A lot of people, are feeling the timeliness of this book as we're thinking about refugees from Ukraine at this moment and what that is like, and especially for young people that are making that crossing. So this is definitely a book that right now is very timely in terms of the refugee crisis from Ukraine and all the fears that one has. As she says, I'm crossing the ocean, but it feels as if the ocean is crossing me. And as I said, the book is in Spanish, and I know that Esther would have written these letters in Yiddish because that was her native tongue. But I don't know Yiddish, and I asked a translator to translate that letter you just saw into Yiddish so that I could just imagine what the letters would have looked like on the page in Yiddish. So the important message that I like to leave people with who read this book is this. Dear Malka, so many people are looking for a place to call home. I want to imagine that the world has a very large heart and can give all of us who have lost our homes a chance to start over. And that's what Cuba did for my family, really gave my family a chance to start over and a chance to survive, and hope that that can continue with other immigrant communities today. So I think we have enough time for me to just tell you a little bit about my previous book, Lucky Broken Girl, which connects with this book, and my new book, which is a picture book. So I often say I am Jewish because I am Cuban, and again, thinking of the refuge that Cuba provided for my family and many other Jewish people in this period between World War I and World War II. And so I'm going to just quickly go through these and tell you a little bit about my previous book and the new one. So everything changes in Cuba, as you all know, with the Cuban Revolution, which begins in 1959 when Fidel Castro comes into power. And the Jewish community at first, along with most Cubans, 99% of the Cuban people supported the revolution. They really wanted a change. Batista had been a terrible dictator, and they were ready for a change. And Fidel Castro seemed to be promising the change that people wanted. And I briefly, at this moment in time, got to attend a Jewish day school in Havana, where we were taught in Spanish and Yiddish. And I always think how interesting that I might have been a Yiddish-speaking person if this school were still around. But instead, my childhood in Cuba was interrupted as the family decided to leave. Most left between 61 and 62 once the revolution turned communist, and most of the Jewish people didn't want to live under a communist system and chose to leave. And the woman you see here with this box is my grandmother, who you've been hearing about, leaving Cuba. And you can see how sad and upset she is. So most Jewish Cubans and most Cubans in this period leave for Miami and for New York and start a new life. And that's what we did. We settled in New York, in Queens. Here I am with my brother and my parents, starting over again. And Lucky Broken Girl is about my story. It's about the Cuban Jewish immigrant girl who goes to New York, has difficulty at first learning English, is getting used to her new life in New York, celebrating her birthday with her mom and family and cousins and friends in their little one-bedroom apartment in Queens. Behind my mother in this picture is the sofa bed where my parents slept, and a little further back is the one bedroom that we had that I shared with my brother. And so there we were, adjusting to life in Cuba when we end up in a horrible car accident. I have a terrible leg injury, and I'm placed in a body cast. And I have to be in bed for a year. So this is what really happened to me. And that inspires the story of this girl, Ruthie, who of course is miserable. But then things start to look up a little bit when the school sends a tutor, a teacher to the house to teach her and brings her a lot of books. And she becomes very smart that year. This is the picture I meant to show you before, but got out of order. And so here's the body cast, an artistic rendition of what that body cast looked like that I was in, and I couldn't be moved from my bed for a year. My mother had to take care of me. And this is the story of Lucky Broken Girl. A young reader sent me this lovely picture. Remember, always have hope, because the story is about having hope, even in difficult times, even when you're in this kind of horrible lockdown that I was in. And Ruthie also learns about Frida Kahlo, the great Mexican artist who had to be in bed quite a lot because of all of her injuries. And she made great art from her bed, and she becomes an inspiration to Ruthie as well. And Ruthie also writes these imaginary letters to Frida Kahlo, the great artist. And even once she comes out of her cast, she finds that it's not that easy to leave your room after you've been alone for such a long time. And she feels a little strange getting out of bed. And so she writes these letters to Frida as she finds her way back into the world. And there's a character in Lucky Broken Girl who resembles my grandmother as well. She's a little different from the character in Letters from Cuba, but definitely a resemblance. And so there's a Polish Jewish grandmother in the story who spends a lot of time at Ruthie's bedside and helps her to get better by telling her stories about her life. And one of the things that she says is, one day you will look back on your suffering and you will find a meaning for it, and that will be your story. And that's indeed what happened. So to end, I also want to let you all know that I have a new picture book. This is my first ever picture book. So this is for a much younger age group, ages 4 to 6, but 4 and up, I guess we could say, Tia Fortuna's New Home. And this is a picture book. So it's a story told in about 800 words. So it's a very, very short story. And I had a lot of fun writing this. So it's the relationship between an aunt and her little niece, her great aunt and her little niece, Tia Fortuna, Aunt Fortune, and her niece, Estrella. Estrella means star. And it's also in Spanish, which is very, very exciting to me. It's being used in some ESL classes right now in Spanish, which is super exciting. And here I wanted to honor my father's side of the family, the Sephardic side of the family that originally came from Spain and left at the time of the expulsion, 1492. This is a synagogue that remains in Toledo, in Spain. wanted to honor that side of the family, the idea of Spaniards without a country, which is one of the ways that Sephardic Jews have been represented historically. So I wanted to honor that side of the family in this story, honor the memory of my paternal grandparents who moved from Turkey to Cuba and started a new life there. And they spoke Ladino, or Judeo-Espanol as we call it. Wanted to honor them. And they were from this town in Turkey called Silivri. And so in the book, I worked with the illustrator to be sure that there were a lot of symbols of Jewishness, and particularly of Sephardic Jewishness. A lot of lucky eye type representations are in the story, and hamsas and things like that that are very frequently used by Sephardic Jews. And the whole theme of memory is a big part of the story. And I like this spread where the girl asks, so is that all you're bringing with you? Because Tia Fortuna has to leave her home by the beach and move to a new home. And she says, I don't need much. I have so many memories in my suitcase right here. And she points to her head. So the theme of memory, the theme of searching for a new home, excuse me, is also found in this book. And I find that my 3 stories so far are all immigrant stories. They're all stories about the search for home. And that's one of the ways that my various stories converge. So I'm going to stop there to be sure that we have a little time for Q&A. Thank you all for listening. And any questions or anything you want to know, please ask. Thank you.
Jane. Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering whether Ruth has any relatives still in Cuba with whom Cuba, with whom you correspond or stay in touch, or is there anybody in the Spanish Jewish community with whom you stay in touch to this day?
Not anymore. We did have a cousin in Cuba who I used to visit on my father's side, but he passed away a number of years ago. So he's gone, and we do have friends of the family who are still there. So our old neighbors in the building where we lived in Havana are still there. So I'm still in touch with them. And for a long time, I was in touch with the woman who took care of me as a child, my brother and me, who was our nanny. I was in touch with her. She's also passed away. So all of those people that were kind of like, that were family or were like family are mostly gone, except for the neighbors who are still in the same building. They still live in the same building where we lived in the late 50s. So that's pretty amazing. But I think of the Jewish community in Cuba as my extended family. So when I've gone there and hung out with people in the Jewish community, I just feel like, well, any of them could be me if my parents had decided to stay rather than leave. You know, I would be there as well. So I feel connected to the people there, the Jewish community there in Cuba. There are a lot of people that share my last name, and you know, we might potentially be long lost cousins. A lot of people with the Behar last name are still in Cuba. So I do wonder about that. But as far as we know, we're not relatives.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Anybody else have any questions about any of the books or the stories or anything you'd like to know
I have
more
a
about?
question. So when Cuba first opened up and allowed American Jews to visit Cuba, did that help the people, I mean, the Jews that were left there?
I think,
as far as maybe feeling like they at least have some support from the United States because so many of their relatives had gone there, or was it a question of, are you coming to look at us like we're in a glass bubble, so to speak?
yeah, no, that's a very, very wisely said, Lois. And I think both. I think the Jewish community in Cuba really came to depend on the support of American Jews. and not just depend, appreciate it as well. I think, as you said, with, there's a continuing US embargo against Cuba, but the fact that Jewish Americans and other Americans, were traveling to Cuba very regularly up until the pandemic, or up until Trump, I would say. Many were traveling on a regular basis, and bringing aid, bringing support, bringing books, bringing information, sending gefilte fish for Passover, matzah, etc. I mean, all of that was very, very appreciated and helped to keep the community going. And the financial support allowed them to offer a meal to people in the Jewish community every Friday night for Shabbat and every Saturday morning for Shabbat. And they had a lot of programs that were also supported by American Jewish visitors, a lot of programs for young people. They had, a film club, they had sports. I got to see that. They have a Sunday school also, and they teach about Jewish history, Hebrew, and it's all ages. It's from children to adult education. And so all those programs were supported by American Jews who went to Cuba and helped out, and also the Joint Distribution Committee and B'nai B'rith and other organizations were also very, very helpful. And all of that mostly dried up right on the eve of the pandemic. It was drying up because my last trip to Cuba was March of 2020, literally a week before the pandemic was declared, and they were already lacking the support that they needed. They were having trouble paying, the electrical bills in the synagogue and so on, and so they were really missing the support of the humanitarian groups that would come and that would share the holidays with them and so on. So I would say overall that support was positive. I think now and then, it could seem like they were being, looked at as, voyeuristically, I guess we might say, that at some points it seemed like that. There were several moments when there were a lot of groups back to back going to Cuba, and I think that sometimes one could get that impression. But I think overall the feeling was that this was good, that it was good to have these encounters, that it was good to have these relationships, that those were necessary to just have a grassroots, connectedness, a people to people, what came to be called a people to people kind of connection. I think overall that was appreciated by everyone, and it was appreciated by American Jews because they wanted to meet people in the community and see what life was like there, and so they got to do that, and then the community profited by getting some of the support that they needed.
Is that changing back to being better now, or has there been any change?
Well, unfortunately not yet, because we don't have that many people traveling to Cuba. A lot of people are still afraid because of, COVID, obviously. I mean, in general, there just isn't that much travel the way there was, and Cuba invested a lot in tourism, and that all of that fell away during COVID. So that's been difficult. And the groups, the humanitarian groups that travel to Cuba haven't really started going yet. There's only a few, like the Nation has some trips to Cuba that they've just started organizing, but there's very, very little organized travel to Cuba. So there may be people going on their own, a handful of people here and there, but overall, from what I know, and I've been in close touch with the vice president of the Jewish community of Cuba, and overall, that's not taking place right now. There's very little support, and they're still doing a lot of their events virtually as well in Cuba because of COVID. So things have not gone back to normal yet in any sort of way in the community, and so and with people not traveling very much, that isn't happening either. They're still receiving some aid, but it's very, very little, and it's very sporadic.
We have one question in the chat and said, was there anti-Semitism in Cuba after 1959?
I would say no, that there wasn't. I think there were a lot of factors involved in this. Even though there were a few Jewish Cubans involved in creating the Communist Party in Cuba, which started in 1925. And there were a few Jewish people that chose to stay in Cuba and become part of the revolution. And so I think that led to high regard for Jewish people, and that's important. Though nevertheless, Cuba and Israel do not have formal diplomatic relations. So officially and publicly, they do not support Israel, but in fact, in real life, they do. And there have been a lot of Israeli engineers that have gone to Cuba to work in the citrus industry and to help Cuba agriculturally and so on. So as far as I know, and from what people tell me in the Jewish community, they have not suffered from anti-Semitism. The community today is a very mixed community. Most people have some Jewish ancestry, might have a grandparent who is Jewish, but many have converted. Many are Jewish just on the father's side, and they have converted formally to Judaism. So everybody has a tie to the larger Cuban society, to mainstream Cuban society, and I think that has also made a difference in possibly controlling any anti-Semitic feelings. One very interesting thing, a number of years ago, they showed Schindler's List on Cuban television. You know, of course, they never pay for copyright in Cuba because, since there's this U.S. embargo against the island, they show whatever they want on Cuban TV, and so they showed Schindler's List, and it was very 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 important for people. I think it gave people who didn't know much about the Jewish story some knowledge of the Holocaust, and so I think that was important. And all the friends that I have made in Cuba who aren't Jewish have all been very, very curious to learn about Judaism. So mostly there just isn't a lot of information. I've had two different friends at different times who've come with me to synagogue because they wanted to see what it was like. They'd heard about it, but they had never been in a synagogue. So there's I would say there's curiosity, and more than anything, more than anti-Semitism. And there is actually a Holocaust exhibit at the Sephardic synagogue in Havana. There's a Sephardic synagogue on 17th and E Street, and they have a permanent Holocaust exhibit sponsored by the Shoah Foundation. And they take school children in Cuba to see the exhibit. So I think overall, there's been good education about the Jewish experience, and from what people tell me in the community, they haven't experienced anti-Semitism.
Well, I want to thank you very much. I don't see any more questions, so I want to thank you very much. I enjoyed visiting with you before everybody else got on. And I am definitely going to read the other books because you've kind of piqued my interest. So,
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here this afternoon. I really appreciate it. If you have any other questions about Letters from Cuba or my other books, feel free to email me. You can find me easily online. You can find my website, and my email is there if you'd like to learn more about my books. And I have a new novel in the works right now that hopefully will be out next fall, and also a new picture book that will be out next fall as well, if everything goes well. So a few more things happening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.